Good afternoon. My name is Darren Ray. I'm an assistant professor of African history here at Brigham Young University. It's my pleasure to introduce our sixth session of the Islamic World Today conference. This session will focus on probing Islamic diversity, Sunni, Shia, and beyond. Just to set the stage. We have created you male and female and appointed you races and tribes that you may know one another. This Quranic vision of a tolerant society can seem far removed from the sectarian struggles that often beset religious communities, including the Islamic Ummah. With this illustrative tension as a starting point, this session will examine the diversity of Islam, put that diversity in historical perspective, and think through its contemporary implications. How do historical tendencies toward fragmentation within Islam impact the Muslim world today? How is Islamic religious identity beyond the Sunni-Shia divide to be discussed without losing sight of that divide's traditional importance? What does pluralism look like in diaspora communities? In short, what is the nature and significance of Islamic pluralism today? Speaking first will be Tahra Kutubuddin, and Abdulaziz Seshadina will follow her. Professor Tahra Kutubuddin is a professor of Arabic literature and Islamic studies at the University of Chicago. She researches classical Arabic poetry, Islamic preaching, the Quran as literature, ethical sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and Shia doctrine, history, and literature. Her most recent book is Arabic Oration, Art and Function, and in 2020, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to support her project to edit and translate a compilation of Ali's sermons called Path of Eloquence, as well as a scholarly book on Ali's religio-political career. Kutubuddin serves as consulting editor of New York University Press's Library of Arabic Literature series and Brill's Shia Islam, Texts and Studies series. She also serves as the director of the Qutbi Jubilee Scholarship Program in Mumbai and of its Interfaith Harmony Conference series, Taqrib. She holds a BA and Tamhidi Magister from Ain Shams University in Cairo and an MA and PhD from Harvard University. Let me introduce Abdulaziz right now as well, so we can have no interruption between the speakers. Abdulaziz Seshadina is professor and IIIT chair in Islamic studies at George Mason University. Seshadina, who has studied in India, Iraq, Iran, and Canada, obtained his PhD from the University of Toronto. He conducts research in the fields of Islamic law, ethics, and theology, both Sunni and Shia. In the last 10 years, he has concentrated on social and political ethics, including interfaith and intrafaith relations, Islamic biomedical ethics, and Islam and human rights. His publications include Islamic Messianism, The Just Ruler in Shiite Islam, The Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism, Islamic Biomedical Ethics, Theory and Application, and Islam and the Challenge of Human Rights, in addition to numerous articles in academic journals. He is an American citizen born in Tanzania. Dr. Kutubuddin, we'd like to welcome you to the stage.
Greetings, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be upon you all. I am very pleased to be among you today, once more in Utah, which is one of my very favorite places to visit and of which I have very fond memories, having taught at the University of Utah for 2 years and having given talks twice before at BYU. I'd like to first thank the LDS Church, Brigham Young University, and the organizers of this conference in the Islamic World Today for inviting me here today to speak, especially Professor Grant Underwood and also Professor James Toronto and my former student at the University of Chicago, Professor Kevin Blankenship. I'm also honored to share this podium with distinguished colleagues and scholars from whom I've learned so much over the past 2 days. And thank you, Professor Ray, for your very kind introduction. Now to my presentation. So I've prepared PowerPoint slides and to give you a visual of my main points, and you're welcome to look at them as I speak or not, whichever works best for you. All Muslims have one prophet, one Quran, one Qibla. Their prophet is Muhammad. Their holy book is the Quran. and their direction of ritual prayer is toward the Kaaba, the house of God in Mecca. They are united in their main beliefs and practices. But there are also significant divergences in doctrine and in practice, and these are largely rooted in the question of leadership. In this panel on diversity in Islam, I will speak about the two largest denominations of Muslims, Shia and Sunni. Other than Sunni and Shia, another approach to Islam is Sufism, or Islamic mysticism. This is not a denomination per se, but an interiorizing approach to Islam, and Sufis have distinct practices of communing with God. In rather stark contrast, Salafism, a branch of Sunnism, is mostly practice-oriented. And there are many other approaches to Islam. In my talk today, however, I'm going to speak only on the Shia and Sunni denominations. I'll focus on the early foundational period when initial differences developed, with a few remarks on later periods and our present time. It's important to remember that Islam is not a monolith, and not all Muslims are the same. It's also important to remember that there are fundamental beliefs and practices that unite all Muslims. In order to understand Islam and Muslims, it's necessary to know both the aspects all Muslims agree on and the aspects they interpret differently. This is a large topic, and I'll have to leave out many details and nuances and caveats. In the half hour at my disposal, I'll endeavor to give you a bird's eye view of the Sunni and Shia denominations, who they are, how they came about, the points that unite them, and the points that divide them. There are several essential beliefs held by all Muslims. Many of you probably know already some of these, but a concise presentation will give you a holistic picture. So first, Islam. Islam means commitment to God's will. And a Muslim is one who commits to God's will. This is the first and basic premise of being Muslim. Often the translation submission is used, and I believe that's less accurate because it takes away the sense of agency and free choice inherent in the concept of Islam. The essential creed of faith for all Muslims is there's no God but God, and Muhammad is God's messenger, la ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah. All Muslims believe in one God who is described in the Quran with attributes such as the merciful, the powerful, the creator, the sustainer. Many conceive of these names as qualities that we must emulate. For in the world of a medieval Muslim philosopher, to be a true philosopher is to emulate God to the highest limit of our human capacity. God is conceived by Muslims in different ways, and I'll speak on this shortly, but all Muslims worship God and strive to attain closeness to him. All Muslims also believe that Muhammad is God's messenger, Rasulullah. They revere him as the conduit of revelation and as a model of virtue and piety. He's seen as the divinely guided guide for humanity, God's mercy for all the world, the perfect human being, and beloved friend and intercessor. His words and practice are a lofty exemplar that all Muslims emulate. Another essential belief is that the Quran is the word of God, and we have heard powerful lectures on these yesterday. Belief in its divine origin is shared by all Muslims. The Quran contains knowledge of all things. It's God's sign and Muhammad's miracle. Through its guidance, it transforms humans into angelic beings. This is similar in broad terms, I think, with LDS theology that teaches that humans are celestial beings in embryo. Arabic is the language of the Quran, and thus the language is also revered. Translations are considered interpretations, and only the Arabic Quran is considered the actual word of God. Now, further important beliefs that all Muslims share are as follows. and they're all based in the Quran. All Muslims believe in the concept of an afterlife. The good enter paradise with the angels, and the evil enter hellfire. All Muslims believe in a chain of prophets. The major prophets, each of whom brought a new law, Sharia, are Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. And the sixth major prophet, the seal of the prophets and the greatest of them all, according to Muslims, is Muhammad. All prophets are believed to convey the same essential message, while their laws change based on the changing needs of the age. They also perform miracles at God's command. The Quran narrates the stories of other biblical prophets as well. David, Solomon, Jacob, Joseph, earlier Enoch, Lot, Isaac, all are considered prophets. Jesus' mother, Mary, is considered most holy, and a full chapter is devoted to her in the Quran. Also, next point, all Muslims believe in the concept of a divine law. All Muslims believe in resurrection in the day of judgment, individual accountability for one's actions. All Muslims believe in a metaphorical path that leads to God, which is embodied in right belief and right action. The first chapter of the Quran invokes the prayer, guide us to the straight path. Also, all Muslims believe in the moral teachings of the Quran and Hadith, including love for one's fellow human beings, piety, kindness, truth, and charity. And all Muslims believe in the spiritual equality of humans before God. Now, in addition to doctrines, all Muslims, or most Muslims, converge on certain points of practice. They perform or aspire to perform certain mandatory acts of worship. So practicing Muslims perform the ritual prayer 5 times a day, which is a series of standings and prostrations, alongside recitations from the Quran and prayers. They offer the annual alms tithe, a percentage of one's income for the benefit of the poor and needy. They fast for 30 days in the month of Ramadan, which entails dawn to dusk abstention from all food and drink, including water. This teaches compassion for the poor. They perform the pilgrimage to Mecca, to what is known as the house of God, at least once in their lives. Now, these are the main points of unity, and there are more, but I'm going to move on to the points of diversity, and I want to first speak on sources of difference. So there are 3 chief sources of difference. The first one is interpretation of Scripture, and you've heard about this at several points during these 2 days. All Muslims believe in the Quran as the word of God, yes, but they interpret the Quran differently. Similarly, the interpretations of Muhammad's words are different. And here, as we heard in the talk yesterday, there's the additional question of which are historically valid. Different groups accept different hadith as authentic. Yeah. I mean, which is why, the interpretations vary so widely, which is why there can never be a united Islam. Islam, you cannot ever answer a question which begins with, what does Islam say about X, right? I mean, it's like asking, what does Christianity say about X, right? Well, there are many, many different positions within the various Christian traditions. What does Judaism say about X? Yes, you could quote a verse of Scripture from the Quran, but someone with another position could say, well, this actually doesn't mean this, this means that, right? So the interpretation of Scripture is a major source of differences within Muslims. Another key basis for difference is interpretation of certain historical events, especially as regards the question of rightful leadership of the Muslim community. And I'll come to that in more detail on that in a minute. Yet another significant basis for difference among Muslims, and this is within denominations as well, is difference in culture. And we've seen a little bit of that also in the last 2 days with the Senegalese traditions, for example, very colorful, very different in some ways. And difference in culture gives rise to differences in social norms. So today, for example, there are Muslims across the globe, Muslims who grew up in the US and Europe, speak English and are influenced in their daily lives and in their religious doctrine and practice by the culture they live in. Muslims who live in East Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East each have their own cultural norms that influence the way they live and the way they interpret the law. According to a 2010 Pew poll, the Arabic-speaking Middle East and North Africa is home only to about 20% of the world's 1.8 billion Muslims, or 1.6, right? Perhaps. Even within each of these, and I wanted to say also that a majority, 62%, live in Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran, and Turkey. So within each of these regions, also within the countries of the Middle East, for example, there are many cultural differences, and these influence the way they practice Islam. These variances influence both religious doctrine and practice. There are different schools of law, different schools of theology, and numerous particularities in how groups of Muslims, even individual Muslims within a group, approach their religion. This has been said in many different ways over these past 2 days, but I think it's important to keep making the point and to keep giving examples of this. Percentages of Sunni and Shia, and now this is coming closer to the main point of the talk, and various sub-denominations within them, as well as of other smaller denominations, has varied over time. Political considerations have played a large role. Regions moved toward one denomination or another, often depending on the support of the ruling dynasty. The Umayyads and Abbasids early on, and the Ottomans later in the central Islamic lands, promoted Sunnism and the Hanafi legal school. The Safavids in 16th century Iran promoted Twelver Shi'ism. In this century, around 15% of all Muslims, roughly 230 million people, identify as Shia, and around 85%, roughly 1.6 billion people, identify as Sunni. Now to the evolution of the Sunni and Shia denominations. So the Prophet Muhammad died in 632 AD in Medina. Although the two groups of Sunni and Shia crystallized gradually over several decades, even centuries, the roots of their disagreement go back to the question of succession. According to the Shia, Muhammad appointed Ali ibn Abi Talib as his successor in a public sermon addressing thousands of Muslims at Ghadir Khum, near Mecca, after his last pilgrimage. The term Shia, by the way, means followers, and it's a shortened version of Shi'at Ali, or followers of Ali. According to the Sunnis, the Prophet praised Ali in this sermon, but he did not indicate succession. Ali was Muhammad's younger cousin, his ward, his son-in-law, and the first male Muslim. He is revered by both Sunni and Shia for his fierce loyalty to the Prophet and his unparalleled valor in establishing the new religion. They narrate many sayings of the Prophet praising him. So here's one: "You, Ali, are my brother in this world and the next." Another: "I am the city of knowledge." This is Muhammad's hadith, and Ali is its gateway. Both Shia and Sunni authors narrate that Muhammad asked the Muslims at Ghadir Khum, "Am I not your Mawla?" I'll explain the key word Mawla in a moment. Yeah, am I not your Mawla? The Muslims replied in one voice, "Yes, indeed you are our Mawla." Muhammad said, "For whomsoever I am Mawla, henceforth Ali is his Mawla. Man kuntu Mawla, fa Aliyun Mawla." The Shia interpret the word Mawla to mean master in light of the Quranic verse, "Allah is the believer's Mawla." Muhammad's statement, the Shia say, is a clear indication of succession appointment. They bolster this claim with other statements and acts by the Prophet, which they interpret as further indications of succession appointment. They believe that Ali inherited Muhammad's spiritual and temporal role as divinely guided guide for the Muslim community, that he was God's choice and Muhammad's choice for this role. The Sunnis interpret the word Mawla as an adoptive member of a tribe, which means someone who is one of your own. And they say that Muhammad loved Ali and wanted to offer him protection against any who may wish him harm. since Ali had been at the forefront of Muhammad's early battles, and the relatives of the pagan Arabians he had killed may have wanted to take revenge. So Sunnis say Muhammad said this in order to protect Ali. According to the Sunnis, Muhammad died without appointing an heir, and the Muslims in Medina chose Abu Bakr to lead the Muslim community. Abu Bakr was a close companion of the Prophet, and you see the names on the slide here, one of the earliest Muslims and Muhammad's father-in-law. He died after 2 years, having appointed Umar, another of the Prophet's prominent companions, as his successor. Umar died 10 years later, having appointed a council of 6 to select the next caliph, and the council chose Uthman. Uthman ruled for 13 years, and when he died, Muslims swore allegiance to Ali as the next caliph. And these four together came to be revered among Sunnis as the rightly guided or Rashidun caliphs. According to the Shia, though, Ali was the only rightful caliph, and the first 3 were usurpers. And this is probably the biggest point of contention and the biggest point of tension among Sunni and Shia. The Shia believe that Ali appointed his son Hassan in his place, and after him his son, Hassan's brother, Hussein, both of whom were grandsons of the Prophet through the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, Fatima's marriage to Ali. So they were Prophet Muhammad's grandsons through Fatima. And after Hussein, the Shia believe, the succession continued in Hussein's line, father to son. Now, that's the early history of the Shi'i-Sunni split. And I'm going to go on to doctrines which developed and were codified over time. There are theological, ritual, and legal differences, and I'll talk about these in a minute. But the fundamental difference between Sunni and Shia is the identity of the supreme leader, one. And also, and this is something many people don't realize, it's also in the nature of this leadership. So the identity and the nature of the leader and the leadership. This is, as you can imagine, it's a very complex topic. I'm going to give you just the bare bones version here. So a key word for this discussion is embodied in the word imam. In its more mundane use among both Sunni and Shia, it refers to an individual who leads the ritual prayer. But in its meaning of leadership of the community of Muslims, the supreme leadership of the community of Muslims, or in a larger form of leadership beyond the local community, the word imam signifies different things. For Sunnis, it refers to any major religious authority, including but not limited to supreme leaders. For Shia, it refers to the Prophet Muhammad's designated descendants. There's one imam in every age. He's the divinely appointed guide for humankind. He's infallible, like the Prophet, and allegiance to him, love for him, and obedience to him are mandatory. In the Creed of Faith, testifying to God's oneness and Muhammad's messengership, Shia add the line, I testify that Ali is God's chosen one. Ashhadu anna Aliyan waliyullah. They further believe that Ali and every imam after him possess certain knowledge acquired through divine inspiration and temporal training. He's the speaking Quran, for he receives inspiration from God. His interpretation of the Quran is the only true interpretation. And love for the Prophet and the family of the Prophet is a fundamental part of Shi'i religiosity, and also, by the way, of the religiosity of most Sunni Sufis. The Shia are divided further into denominations according to the lines of imams they accept as legitimate, the largest being the Twelvers, Zaydis, and Ismailis. Twelvers and Ismailis believe the predecessor imam appoints a successor by divine inspiration. Zaydis believe that any male descendant of Ali and Fatima, if he's learned and draws his sword to establish the truth, is the imam. Also, across time, small groups proclaimed divinity of Muhammad, Ali, or various imams, and they have been termed exaggerators, but these have historically been a small minority. Today, Twelver Shi'ism, the largest Shi'i sect, represents the overwhelming majority in Iran. And if you could move on to the next slide, please. Yes. Twelver Shiism was promoted in Iran through the 16th through the 18th centuries by the Safavid Shahs, and today, Twelvers are also the majority in Iraq, Lebanon, and Bahrain, and significant minorities are found in Syria, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, and India. Zaydis were important in the 9th to 11th centuries in Iraq and northern Iran, and they're confined to Yemen. Ismailis, also called Fatimids, controlled Egypt and much of the eastern Mediterranean between the 10th and 12th centuries, and they dispersed after the end of the Fatimid Caliphate. Small communities remain in Syria and Iran, but the bulk are now in India, with smaller numbers in Pakistan, Tajikistan, Yemen, and in diaspora. The Twelvers now believe that the 12th Imam went into metaphysical occultation in the 9th century, and he will appear as the Messiah, the Mahdi, at the end of time. In his absence, the community is guided by jurists known as ayatullahs, or God's signs, who interpret the Quran, the Prophet's hadith, and the words and actions of the Imam. And believers today choose a living ayatullah to follow. The Ismailis today have two main subdivisions, Nizaris and Tayyibis. Nizaris believe their current Imam, who's also known as the Aga Khan, is in Muhammad's line. Tayyibis believe that the 21st Imam, whose name was At-Tayyib, went into physical concealment, and the imamate continues in his line, in concealment, father to son. And he's represented among the people by an unbroken chain of leaders called Da'i, each appointed by his predecessor, who's spiritually guided by the imam and who guides the community. The Zaydis today currently do not have an imam, and they consider the situation doctrinally possible. Among Sunnis, supreme leadership of the community has historically meant different things, but it has usually included both temporal and spiritual authority of some kind, though not in the same degree as the Shia version. Sunnis usually use the term caliphate rather than imamate, although they sometimes use the two words interchangeably, and the Shia also use the term caliphate, so it's not mutually exclusive. According to Sunnis, the caliph must be from the Prophet's tribe of Quraysh. Therefore, rightly guided caliphs were from Quraysh, as were the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties who ruled the Muslim empire for several centuries. The caliphate, they say, is a necessary institution, but the caliph, unlike the Prophet, is fallible and can be nominated in a variety of ways, including appointment by predecessor, election by a council, or nomination by an individual or individuals. Early on, among proto-Sunnis, there were groups who rejected the caliphates of Uthman or Ali, but eventually all four early caliphs were canonized. After the end of the Ottoman Turkish Caliphate in the early 20th century, there is no accepted caliph among the majority. And the Sunnis now take their name from the word sunnah that we have heard about, or the practice of the Prophet. The term developed gradually until from the late 8th century, it was commonly applied to this interpretation of Islam. A catalyst to the formation of formal Sunnism was the rise to fame of a jurist named Ibn Hanbal, who championed the Prophet's practice, or sunnah, to promote a literalist vision of Islamic law. It's also argued that Sunnism arose as a defined denomination in response to the crystallization of Shi'i doctrines. I'm following on now from differences in the concept of leadership and the views of particular leaders. Other aspects of Islam also diverge. In terms of law, all schools, Sunni and Shia, look to the Quran and the Prophet's practice as primary sources of guidance, but they diverge in the specifics of interpretation and in the method of interpretation also. So some are literalist and lean toward the letter of the law. Others are rationalist and privilege the spirit of the law. Over time, several legal schools have emerged with their own founders and texts and approaches. Among the Sunnis, there are four major schools of law today: Hanafi, Hanbali, Maliki, and Shafi'i. And there are differences between and also within law schools or legal schools regarding, for example, women's rights and criminal laws and ideas of jihad and so on. Dietary laws also are mostly similar. But here too, there are differences. So no pork and no alcohol for all Muslims, most Muslims. But what about coffee? Legal schools initially differed on this one. And in fact, the word qahwa, which many of scholars of Islam also actually don't necessarily know, is used in pre-Islamic poetry to mean wine. I mean, there are other names for wine, but qahwa meant wine, and it was used for this word because they weren't sure what it did to the mind. Eventually, people, most schools coalesced around the idea that it was okay, it was legal, it wasn't, thank you, and it wasn't an altering of rationality in the way that, that wine was. Okay, so within Sunnism, most people self-identify through their legal school. Among the Shia, identity is based rather on the line of imam or imams a group follows, and each line has their own legal school. Theology. There are various understandings of the Creator. Most Sunnis today understand God to have a physical form with hands and a face, for example, as described literally by the Quran, but quoting a term without asking how, bila kaif. It's a technical phrase coined by the 10th century theologian al-Ash'ari. 12 Shia follow an earlier rational school of theology, rationalist school of theology, and conceive of God as spirit. Ismaili Shia believe the Creator is neither body nor spirit, but is transcendent, the creator of both body and spirit, and simply beyond human imagination. Other contested theological issues include free will versus predestiny, the origin of the Quran, also what constitutes faith. Different answers are given by different Muslim groups, and they mention acknowledgement by the tongue, belief in the heart, acts by the body, and so on. For most Muslims, though, these theological issues are issues they don't really delve into that much. The Shia also share with Sunnis the main holy days of the Islamic calendar, which are called Eid. Eid al-Adha coincides with the culmination of the annual pilgrimage rites in Makkah, Eid al-Fitr after Ramadan, and Eid al-Milad, the Prophet's birthday, which was just celebrated yesterday and today. And Mubarak to all Muslims in the audience for this auspicious day. Distinctly Shi'i holy days include Ashura, remembering the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson Hussein, and Ghadir, which celebrates Muhammad's appointment of Ali. Pilgrimages to tombs of venerated individuals is important among Shia and Sunnis, and most Sunnis. In my presentation so far, I've spoken about points of unity and divergence among the Sunni and Shia denominations of Islam. And before I end, I want to say a few words on what I believe is an important related question, that of tolerance versus conflict between Muslim denominations and between Muslims and people of other faiths. So here are some frequently cited Islamic texts on the slide that promote respect and caring for others. The Quran says there is no compulsion in religion, la ikraha fid din. Elsewhere, the Quran says, and this is the verse used in the write-up describing our panel and that Professor Ray read out, we have created you male and female and appointed you races and tribes that you may know one another. The most honored among you in the eyes of God is the one who is most pious. The Prophet Muhammad said, all humans are children of God, and God loves best those who most help his children. Al-khalqu iyalullah, wa ahabbu an-nas ila Allahi anfa'uhum li'iyalihi. I've written about Imam Ali's conception of justice and his pluralist vision in detail in a forthcoming article, and I'll give you just one example of what he says. Ali enjoins his governor in Egypt, Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr, to treat all his subjects, Sunni, Shi'i, Jew, and Christian, with fairness, for, and I quote, they are either your brothers in faith, or your peers in humanity. إِمَّا أَخٌ لَكَ فِي الدِّينِ أَوْ نَظِيرٌ لَكَ فِي الْخَلْقِ. These are the teachings of Islam, but the reality on the ground has been checkered. Under Muslim rule, through history, there have been times of persecution and also times of collaboration. Radically intolerant ideology was seen among the Kharijites or seceders in the 1st century of Islam, who branded any Muslims who disregarded or disagreed with their interpretation of Islam as heretics, and they attacked and pillaged and killed. And we see their heirs today among fringe groups like ISIS. In contrast, we see beautiful periods of harmony that can serve as exemplars for Muslims and indeed for all people. The medieval Fatimid Shia dynasty who ruled Egypt are by and large a model of inclusivist and tolerant governance for Sunni and Shia, Christian and Jew. Similarly, the Sunni rulers of Spain promoted by and large a space of harmonious coexistence among Muslims, Jews, and Christians. I want to end on a personal note. I'm Muslim, and I believe it's vitally important for Muslims to emulate exemplars of peace and to reject promoters of intolerance. We each have our own strong beliefs and convictions, and that's as it should be. Else, what does it mean to have conviction and belief? But we must respect the choices of others, and we must build on our points of unity rather than squabble over our points of difference. This is what my late revered father, Sayyidina Khuzaima Qutbuddin, has taught me, and I serve as one of the directors of the Taqrib academic organization for communal harmony that he founded in India. Taqrib is an Arabic word which means to bring people closer. I also believe that it's equally important for non-Muslims to understand the ethical and spiritual bedrock of the scriptures of Islam, and to recognize the diversity and beauty of Muslim cultures and communities. Each one of you, each one of us can make a difference. So use your talents, use your skills, reach out to whoever you can to promote understanding, respect, love, compassion, harmony. Yeah. This conference, I think, has taken an excellent step in that direction. Thank you for your attention.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace. I'm very, very grateful to the invitation that I received from Professor Grant Underwood. And this is my first visit to Utah. And I've fallen in love with this place. It's so beautiful. And I want to share with you something that is important to keep in mind, that in my life of teaching religious studies for the last 54 years, I'm 80 years old, I'm not young, but I started quite early. I always learned to respect other religions. I can teach Christianity as respectfully as I teach Islam. There's nothing that will fall short in my approach to any other communities. And I believe that there's a purpose for which I have been created. If I were to engage in the diversity, then I would start with saying that I wasn't a privileged undergraduate whose parents were rich to send him to America to be educated. I was orphaned from the age of 10. And I remember coming home from the school and my mother didn't have food on the table. That's the life that I saw and I was brought up in. So I have a special relationship with all human beings. But I'm also aware that we don't like to speak about disagreements. Muslims are no different. They don't want to speak about the differences among themselves, whether it is interpretive differences, theological differences, legal differences, or ethical differences. There's a fear that if we engage in bringing out differences, we might then endanger our claim to the truth, which is being held by the majority. Majority always is afraid that minority should not be given the voice. Otherwise, they might expose some of the irregularities that the majority are practicing. It's been true with all religious communities. I've gone around the world 3 times, each and every country I visited. And I was always interested in human beings, wherever I went. And what I realized was that polemics is part of the self-identity. We do engage in polemics in order for our own self-identification. Not only that, it is also a claim to be my position, to be the only position that is right. It is to become self-righteous. And all the founders of religions were knowledgeable about that. There was a fear in the minds of even the founders of the religion that lest our followers become intolerant toward those who don't accept the message. So there was always room made for those disagreements. But we are living in the world of technology, in the world of cyberspace. Anything that happens anywhere in the world today, we know it within seconds. We are no more private. My sons tell me that our televisions that we see are actually spying on us. They know what we are watching. They know what things we are, interested in. That's why they show us these things. And my son, who I'm not so savvy about technology, but they come and they teach me. Haven't you seen that you are looking for a pair of shoes and how you open your computer and the pairs of shoes come to show you, as if they know that you are looking for it. In the world of differences, what I have noticed with the Shia and the Sunni communities today, technology has become the tool of mutual attacks on one another. We are now talking about red Shiism, which is opening history for the first time for the communities in any part of the world. COVID-19 was an opening for people to sit home and watch the speaker they wanted to listen to. It was no more one speaker in one part of the world, who was locally available to the audience in that part. Now we can hear from London, from France, I don't know from where, and we can hear the preachers of different caliber and different program. What we are hearing on the programs is extremely dangerous, because it is going to smash the bridges of understanding and create even more difficulties. My sister Tyra, she presented us very sources of doctrinal, theological, legal differences that might exist. But there's something more that is going on. Rituals are being revived to create what we call mutual misunderstanding. What is important to keep in mind is that modern theology has not been formulated by any of the religious communities. I'm talking about Muslims. They're not talking about new kalam. They're not talking about new theology anymore. Theologies were written down in those centuries that Tahira spoke so well about them. These doctrines were formulated in the Middle Ages of Islam, and they are still dominant in the way we see each other. The universal language has not emerged in this new theology. And that new universal language is the language of ethics. We've been hearing about communities engaged in talking to one another, but the language is still the language of condemnation. There is takfir that is being done. We call that Shiism in Toronto now, red Shiism. So there's red Shiism, there's green Shiism. I don't know about other communities, but I know some of these groups that meet to condemn other Muslims for not being part of them. And this is extremely, I think, unknown in the annals of the religious differences. There's been lots and lots of battles fought between Sunnis and the Shias, the Mughal Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Ottoman Empire. They did not agree with one another. And there were political reasons for them to fight. And yet, the religious reasons were also used to separate the people. The Safavids were not innocent. The Ottomans were not innocent either. One was the Sunni, and the other was the Shia. And there was this struggle going on. Mughal Empire in India also had the rulers, some of them were Shia inclined, some of them were not. In other words, you have differences of dynasties that created their own theologies and their own sources of justification of power and authority. So we have inherited diversity, but not always as a source of celebration, rather as a source of mutual suspicion. And mutual suspicion creates what we call, it damages spirituality. Because spirituality, if it is equality of all human beings, then we are utterly failing the moment we reduce other human beings to a dehumanized position. And that's what religion is capable of doing. Today, that kind of understanding is extremely dangerous. I spent 2015 6 months in Iran and 6 months in Iraq. And both these countries have their own understanding of their own identity. There are voices that are trying to create tolerant situation. They don't want to engage in polemics anymore. Ayatollah Khamenei, for example, is firmly believing that some of the volumes that have been written in the past in the Arabic language should not be republished at all, because they are the source of animosity among Muslims. That is not being appreciated in India and Pakistan, who want that to be kept alive. In other words, there are battles being fought within the community, intra-faith. I think that I want to interject here, transcript somewhat, that there is no dialogue between Muslims talking to one another. Even the scholars are not talking to one another, leave alone the people, ordinary people. I don't regard myself Shia anymore. I am being labeled by Shia, by my colleagues, by everyone, because I wrote books about Shiism that are controversial. My first book on Islamic Messianism is highly controversial, for which there was a fatwa issued against me by Ayatollah Sistani, that I am no more allowed to speak in the Muslim communities. I'm not allowed to speak in the Shia communities. I'm persona non grata for all of the Shia organizations. But Iran, it has invited me. Iraq, I have been there. And although the Ayatollah Sistani is in Iraq, Iraq has not obeyed the rule, prohibiting me to speak. But you can imagine what a threat I must have become to the institutions. Now, let me bring to this last point here that there is institutionalization of the rituals today. And there are several rituals that we can talk about, but I'm sure that you can see them on YouTube if you want to. Just see Karbala, see Najaf, all of these places, see Muharram, see Arba'in, the 40th of Imam Hussein, and you will see the rituals that are connected. What has happened to these rituals is they have been institutionalized. Once the ritual becomes institutionalized, as the Sufis taught us correctly, it loses connection with the spirituality. It becomes a source of identity. So you perform it without knowing why are you performing it. Because others are performing, you are performing it. Those rituals are there. They are completely being institutionalized through the travel. I call this post-Saddam development. When Saddam was still in power, the Shias could not visit Iraq freely. Only some Shias were allowed. Bohras could do that because they were not seen to be a threat to the government. But the 12 were not permitted. Iranians for many, many years did not go to Iraq. One of the major rituals that is different between Shia and the Sunni is the spiritual and devotional aspect of the wilaya. That they go and they visit their imams. They go and perform the pilgrimage. So this is, by the way, in addition to the pilgrimage that all Muslims perform, which is Hajj, which is going and visit Medina, the city of the Prophet. But these are the other places, and there are women saints as many as men saints. So in Cairo, you can visit, for example, the Zainab. You can go in other places and visit all these shrines, Sayyida Nafisa. All of these are buried, and these are the women of Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. This is when this becomes ritualized, this ziyarah is an important part of the Shia identity. In the modern times, it has become more easy to travel. And post-Saddam era has opened the shrine cities. The development of shrine cities is amazing. If you go and visit them, it is something. And I've seen Sunnis also visiting Iraq. All the shrines that the Shia visit, they are now visiting it. Also in Cairo, where you find the Ismaili community visits more often because there are shrines that belong to their imams there. In other words, there is this ritualization and institutionalization of the rituals. Kuwaitis, Bahrainis, all of them, they come to this. That's one of the important rituals. The second important ritual that has been very much institutionalized is, and it is competing now with Hajj, is the 40th day of Imam Hussein's, the Prophet's grandson's, martyrdom. So 40th day has now become larger than the Hajj in Iraq. I don't know this. I don't know how to find out whether these figures are correct or not. 25 million, they say, the Shia go on the 40th of Imam Hussein in Karbala. It is drawing. One of the things that has happened is that it has revived one of the most important things that I learned from my Mormon friends, the idea of service. My Mormon friends tell me that something that the church is teaching us, because my children went to the Mormon church for their scouting, so I know what they were learning. And there was one very important virtue, that there is an idea of service, where you serve other people without any kind of discrimination in your mind. You try to do that. You try to do that. And that's what we find that Arba'in is revived. It has become international. There's so much money today that ordinary Shia, ordinary people can spend. And there are so many charity organizations. unimaginable how this small ritual of 10 days, by the way, and then you walk between the city of Najaf and Karbala, which is 83 kilometers. You walk that. And men and women and children, all of them are participants. Internationally, they go there. And this is unlike the Hajj, where you are bound by certain rituals. You must perform those. You must do those. Here, there is something that allows you to move freely. And you are being entertained by, it's almost like a carnival, that people are coming together, there's food being served, there is, religious songs being played, all of this, and this has become one of the most important source of identification today. But it is an identity that separates the community from the larger majority. It is not a Sunni practice. It is a Shia practice. Sunnis do participate, but it is a Shia practice that you go and visit Imam Hussein on foot. And they say, this is how Imam Hussein's sister Zainab, she traveled. When she was, imprisoned by Yazid, the Umayyad Caliph, when she was set free, she wanted to visit his brother's grave. And she went there, and she traveled on the camel, and she walked on the foot between these two places. And it has become one of the most cherished visits per year. My sons wanted to go. So they took me 3 years ago. Three of us went. But they walked. I could not walk 83 kilometers, but they did. And it is something that has become a symbol of the new kind of Shiism that is nurtured by very rich people. So I sit in Charlottesville and I have 3 friends, and I say, I can send you to Iraq if you want for Arba'in, go. I'll pay for you. That kind of visits, by the way, it's such big issue today. And what has happened, there are now hospitals, clinics, built by Syrians, by Iranians, all over throughout the road that takes you. And it is amazing to see this kind of rituals that are not known in the Muslim. I, as a person, I've traveled, I've studied in Mustansiriya in Baghdad. I've studied in Iraq, in Najaf, and Iran. And all of these places where I've studied, I have never seen this phenomenon to this extent, so international. In other words, you have a new identity, not only identity that is connected with rituals, but identity that is connected with service. So you ask people, there are three books have come out in English, by the way, about Arba'in. And there were some American women who went and walked through, I don't remember their names, but there are 3 books that have been written. And they are describing what they asked, they did the field work. In other words, you discover that I think the modern times has made it possible for all of these things to come together in a place so remarkably, unknown until now. So you find that most of these, ideas of we will not talk about our differences, we will not talk about, but we will talk about unity, but they're actually entrenched in diversity and in dividing, rather than bringing together. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize, that modern times, with all its tools in traveling and everything that we are able to do, the differences between people are sometimes, they are narrowed, there are bridges of understanding if you travel, if you meet people, but there is also a time when you begin to differentiate yourself and you become separated from others. And that's what is, at the moment, the source of worries in the leaders. So let me conclude by saying that there are 2 kinds of Islam that I see. There's 2 kinds of Islam that I see. One is the Islam of the ulama, the scholars. And the other is the Islam of the populace. what I find to be quite revealing is that the populace is trying to find an Islam which has universal idiom. They are talking about not only the service, but they are also very much part of this movement towards virtuous life, something that is, missing in the modern times. I connect Arba'in, this whole process of visiting Iraq for 10 days, is in a way trying to compensate self-alienation of the modern life. Modern life is very self-alienating. It is a very lonely life to live, you know it, You are living in the neighborhood, you don't know your neighbors for 30 years, Who is living next to you? There's no way that you could connect. I still remember going to Charlottesville, small place, and my wife cooking Middle Eastern food and sending to the neighbors here and here and here. Oh, we thought it would start conversation. That's how it happens in Cairo. That's how it happens, in Tehran. You go there and you live there and you cook something and they ask you, well, how did you make it? There was no questions. In Charlottesville, nobody was interested. Well, I used to go to Istanbul and write cards to my neighbors in Charlottesville, and they would not even respond. They were surprised. Why would I send a card to them? This must be very unusual. I think that kind of fear of the modern life, it's all being somehow compensated in something new that is happening. This religiosity is very different. It's not a regular religiosity. People are not talking about prayers 5 times. They're talking about freeing people. They're talking about sitting together and, having a conversation that is spiritual. I could go on in describing all these narratives, but I want to conclude that it's been a great opportunity for me to open this subject for the first time in this gathering. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Drs. Kutubuddin and Sachedina. We'll now invite Dr. Brown and Dr. Fahmy to the stage. And we'll continue with this discussion section until 3:05. We're going to take our time that was taken from us. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to start with Dr. Fahmy.
Sure.
Would you like to begin?
Is this on? Yeah. So this is the problem when you have 3 Islamic studies scholars and a political scientist. I have to ask you a political question. So you spoke about the foundational period and difference and division, but also all of the similarities and the ethical and spiritual bedrocks of Islam that transcend the difference. And Dr. Sachedina, you talked about the differentiation and technology and the role of ritual. But for those of us who just look at the political landscape of places like Iraq and Bahrain and Lebanon and Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan, we see the weaponization of difference and the nature of the narrative of politics in sectarian terms. And I was wondering if you can speak to that, to speak to what we see on TV and how we analyze the world in sectarian terms. Because in spite of everything that we've all been saying, we know that last Friday, on our holiest of days of the week, we had a bombing of a Shia mosque in Afghanistan, and one the week before that, where dozens of people were killed. And so how do we make sense of this? And I know we can't to a certain extent, but if maybe you can speak to what we see on TV in the political sense. Thank you.
Okay. That was the question I expected. And maybe the question I dreaded, but also the question I wanted, actually, because I think that's what it boils down to, right? So, okay, we can talk about all of the historical events that happen, all of the issues there, but how does that translate into our lived reality today? And the lived reality is you know, in the incidents that you described, heartbreakingly sad, right? I mean, so why should Muslims who all believe in Muhammad, who all love Muhammad, who all pray toward the Kaaba, who all believe that the Quran is the word of God, kill each other? And that's the mind-boggling question. I have many thoughts on this, but I'll just say a couple of things. One thing is that I don't think that's the only reality. And that is what gives me hope, because I see on the ground many individuals, many organizations who are making, I mean, not only making conscious efforts, but that's part of who they are. I mean, you know, people from different denominations of Islam, legal schools, different Shia, Sunni, different types of ideologies versus, you know, regarding modernity or and veiling or not veiling, all of these kinds of things. Many people come together in brotherhood and sisterhood and humanity. And that's happening all over the globe all the time. And that's just not shown on TV. I think that's probably again, I don't know if one can do a poll of this kind of thing, but if one were to be able to do a poll, it would show that there are a large number of folks who are actually loving their human beings and their fellow Muslims. The other point is, of course, the violence and the intolerance that we also see, and that we see very large and clear on our screens and you know, from time to time. And I've experienced both sides, you know, personally as well. And I think that for the second, you know, for the violence that we see, I think that a large part, not completely, not 100%, but a large part of it is driven by politics. That is not a given, or that it has to be this way. It's certain politically, I mean, this is what you spoke about, right? In terms of what's happening in this country. It's politicization of difference and driving it. And I see that in my, you know, the country in which I was born, India, between Hindus and Muslims. It's, you know, Hindus and Muslims have lived together for hundreds of years in times of, you know, love and brotherhood and peace. To a large extent. But right now what we're seeing on the ground is something that's fomented by politicians to a large extent. Anyway, I'll stop there, but thank you for your question.
Yeah, I think that I want to add something that a community that is victimized and the victimhood is not admitted. I think political psychologists would tell us that one of the ways of reducing violence and violent reaction is for those who inflict, you know, violence on the minorities, they need to acknowledge it, and they need to apologize for their, you know, violence. And I think that in many cases today, if there is a mosque, if Hazaras are being shot down in Afghanistan, no Muslim organization, even in the United States, condemns that. And I think that indifference becomes a source of further agony. As we say, l'angoisse is a kind of anxiety that is created by, I'm not being recognized as a human being. My life is not worth, you know, defending by anyone. And therefore, you know, here is the situation of a minority that is suffering. And now then, when they react to that thing, they become even more violent. And I think that it has been going on, it's like a ping pong, you know. You know, here, you ignored us, you didn't care for us. Now here is a Muslim organization, you know. ISNA, I have been to ISNA meetings so many times. There was never recognition of the Shia minority. Sometimes they did it so poorly that there were no representatives who could speak. So in other words, when a community is minority is downplayed by the majority, who believes that we are doing everything good. And this is also, by the way, the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The politics that are being played out here are shocking sometimes. That how Saudi Arabia is pumping in their petrodollars to increase even more problems, and how Iran is also pumping in its own resources to respond. And the people are victims, and they are, being drawn to one side or the other side. It's not a very pleasant situation.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, do you want to just continue on that line, or you want to propose a new direction?
I had another question. I was listening to the presentations. I was, Tahara's was so comprehensive and clear. I actually didn't have any questions. It's like, this is a really good presentation. Like, it's a lot of, like, I should do this for my classes, actually. And then Dr. Sajidina's presentation, I think, was pretty clear. I actually was thinking maybe I can ask a question that I've always wondered, as someone who's, although I don't feel like particularly Sunni, I'm not. I guess I'm not Shia, so I'm Sunni by default. But I was wondering, in the Shia tradition, there's this, very strong, veneration and respect for Ali, and then veneration and respect for Hussein. And then other figures from the house of the Prophet as well. But those are like the two that stand out, at least from what I've seen. And I've always wondered, like, how, if you're, and maybe I'm going to ask this question like in an offensive way. I mean, forgive me if I do so. But how do you know when and in what circumstance and how to, like, think about the Prophet? And then how and when and for what reason and what circumstances you think about Ali, and then how, and the same thing for Hussein. Like, what is it? Is there sort of like, oh, well, I'm going to think about this issue, so I'll think about the Prophet. Like, I don't think about that issue, so I think about. I don't know if that's a clear question or not, for both of you.
I think it's a very clear question, and I think I have a very clear answer. I hope. If you venerate Muhammad and you consider Ali to be his successor, and you consider Hussein to be an imam who sits also in the place of the Prophet and of Ali in his own time. In Shia belief, that's the sun, the moon, and the star. So all of them give light and guide, and so they provide guidance, right? And do you think of the Prophet or Ali or Hussein when you think of particular issues? Think of all of them, because they're teaching the same thing. That's the general, that's, I think, what many Shia would say. The teachings are the same. And you could, ask the question in a different way. So if you believe that Jesus taught something, and Muhammad taught something, and Moses taught something, who would you think of in a particular? Well, they're all teaching the same thing. They're all God's prophets.
I think there is a doctrinal aspect to it. There's a doctrinal aspect to it, that revelation of the Quran stopped with the Prophet when he died. But the revelation in the sense of the divine guidance continues with the succession of the Prophet. In other words, there's an idea in the Shi'i mind that the Quran needs a spokesperson. In the Quran, it says Imam al-Natiq, the one who can speak. So Imam is regarded, Ali or Hassan or Hussein or wherever the Imams, they are regarded as speaking Imams. They are the Quran is a silent Imam. It doesn't speak, but you need someone to speak for the scripture, and that's the kind of understanding that they have.
Would that be
was a good question.
Would that be
Thank you.
appropriate?
It wasn't offensive.
It was not offensive. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Brown, that I think answers your question from a Shia perspective. What would a Sunni perspective take issue with that, or would that seem to be in line with your thinking of how Hadith scholars?
No, I think it's. I always, I guess, when I try to do what Professor Qutbuddin did for my students, I try to sort of talk about like the idea of the Prophet's authority being, it doesn't die when he dies, right? It's passed on, and then the sort of disagreements happen about how that succession or how that transmission or passing on of authority happens, like who gets it. And in the Sunni community, it's like the entire community gets it. And of course, that has its own problems. And in the Shiite tradition, it's the family of the prophet gets it. And then, of course, you have questions about which person gets it and lines of succession. But I mean, I think that, when I was in, I got kind of inoculated against anti-Shiism when I was in college because my best friend from college was a Pakistani Shiite guy. He's a great guy. Sometimes not the best Muslim, but he's a great guy. He would always play Qawwali music for me, and he would tell me about it. And I think I really learned to appreciate kind of what this meant to him, and kind of feel like these emotions with him. But I was always I would go to Majlises during Muharram with him. These are maybe actually this would be really interesting for you to tell the audience about the Majlis, during Muharram, and that was a really moving experience. But it was so different from anything that I'd experienced as a Sunni. You don't have these kind of things, and so I guess in some ways my question came out of this idea of that you couldn't really think about these people in the same time because my experiences of feeling the death of Hussein was so different than anything I'd ever felt as a Sunni in the various ritual settings that I was in. So, I mean, I'm not at all questioning your explanations. I think they probably make complete sense. But I think the reason was I felt like these were two different activities. But I don't know. Maybe I don't know if it's appropriate for they can tell the audience about the Majlises, which are pretty fascinating.
Dr. Fahmy, do you have a question, or shall we
Majlis.
speak on that a little bit?
I think that the Muharram gatherings are the times when the lectures that you heard, they were very different in content also. But these are the ones that are being used as the propagation of religion.
So a majlis is lectures during Muharram.
That's right. There are lectures speaking about the revolution of Imam Hussein, and then you connect it, to the Iranian politics. You can connect it to all kinds of, oppressive governments in the modern times. So it's what we call projections in different areas of the politics. I find those majlises to be very political sometimes, depending on the preacher. The preacher sometimes is a peace-loving person. Otherwise, most of the time, these are the ones who are going to, talk about the Sunni-Shia divide and how the Sunnis were bad guys and the Shias are the good guys. So you have that kind of tone also, being conveyed to the people. Sometimes you come out of these gatherings very angry at your Sunni friends or whatever they are, So it has worked in both ways. And more, Iran is trying to say that don't bring those topics that divide Muslim community. Bring only those topics that are keeping them together. But I don't know how much others are doing that.
That reminds me, you introduced me years ago to Abdullahi Nasser's Ramadan lectures in East Africa. And he took the exact opposite approach in those lectures, which was he felt that a lot of the extremism and the politicization of difference was bred through ignorance. And so he used his lectures to teach people what a madhab was, to teach them what a Sunni was and Shia, but not for the purpose of dividing, but for the purpose of understanding. And yet he had to do that partially because he had converted to Shiism. Yes. In a very predominantly Sunni community, and he was being ostracized politically and everything else. And so his response to that was education. And so I like your point that goes both directions. It can both divide depending on the preacher or also bring together. Dr. Fahmy.
If you'll indulge me, Dr. Qutbuddin, Dr. Sachedina, and of course Don Esposito, you are our elders in many ways, and Jack's concentric circles, you're much closer than the rest of us. And I was wondering, as the 2 days come to an end after our next panel, but if possibly you can share with us and all of the students in the audience some words of advice.
As advice. I thought your approach was very good. It opened up, different chapters of the history and the development of the two schools of thought. But I think that it also made it possible to have a dialogue that, okay, this is how the Sunnis believe, this is how the Shias believe. We need to come and to talk to one another about it, rather than, closing the doors of dialogue. I think my advice would be, if you agree with me, that we both feel, because I've talked now I've known Tahira Qutbuddin very well, and I think that we share this concern that it's partly our responsibility to build bridges of understanding. We should not be there to burn those bridges. John Esposito, when he first invited me to go to Holy Cross, it was the time of Iranian Revolution. And Iran Revolution was a mystery in North America. Who is this Khomeini? What are we going to do with this man, 78, 79? So I remember he was the one who saying that, let's get Aziz, to tell us what exactly it is, And we had the first meeting in Holy Cross, talking about the differences between the two schools of thought. And I think I carried on that work. I hadn't even written about my first controversial book, but that's when, the whole movement started. We need to keep our hearts open, our minds open to two possible interpretations. There isn't one. I think pluralism is built into the system, not only the four schools of legal thought, but also, the division between Muslims. Shias are also not of one stock. Iranian Shias are so different than the Iraqi Shias are. When you live among them, you find out. And Indian Shias and Pakistani Shias are very different from all those that are in Iran and Iraq, And East African Shias, now we have Bilalian Shias, the black Shias, and they are very different. And they are more madhab-oriented. They want to learn how to practice religion. They are not interested in hatred and how do we, hate a Sunni or follow a Shia. No, it's a very good approach.
Yeah. And I completely, may I? I completely concur. I think it's important to educate, to analyze, to be introspective and transparent, and to communicate and have a dialogue. And I think, what you said, that it's important. Ignorance is, you promote connections and mutual respect through understanding. And ignorance is really what stops that. And to quote Imam Ali again, الناس أعداء ما جهلوا. People are enemies of what they do not know, because they fear that, right? So it's like this big black hole, and who knows what's there. But if you talk about things and discuss similarities and differences respectfully, versus being afraid of what will happen if you do, I think that is the really the ideal space for promoting understanding. And yes, you're different. Human beings are different in a family. I'm very different from my husband, and we have different things that we like and don't like, and eat and don't eat, But we love each other, and we love, so that's the human family. We have to kind of appreciate the good in every single human being and be able to, and again, with that, I think it's really, really, really important to talk not only about the things that unite us, but to be able to talk about the things that are different, right? Without condemning, without kind of coming out militantly. That's why I think this kind of thing is so very important to have folks kind of come and listen and learn about things. When I first came to Utah, I didn't know, I'd never heard of LDS or the Book of Mormon. But I was really, really interested. You know, I had a lady staying with me once when we first came, and she was helping me take care of my little son. And she was away while I was teaching a class one day, and she's Catholic. And so she came, you know, very nervously to the door as I entered and kind of handed me the Book of Mormon and said, someone came to her door and gave her the Book of Mormon. And she's like, and I said, I'm Catholic. I don't want, it was like she was really afraid. And I said, you know, Rosie was there. I said, Rosie, give me the book. I want it. I want to read it. I want to learn about this. And I think it's really important. I mean, I feel that there's so much I want to learn about, you know, the LDS community, all of the religious communities, all of the different Muslim communities, their thoughts, their histories, their hopes, their aspirations. Yeah.
Dr. Fahmy, you started this part of the session asking about how we understand violence between Muslims. And I think what you just illustrated well is how intra-community dialogue is so essential to also understanding inter-community dialogue between religious communities. As you have more of those conversations within your religious community, you have a greater desire and a love to build community, and that will only promote that tolerance and sense of understanding and expectation of wanting to learn more about other religious communities as well to breed that. So thank you very much for all of your contributions to the session. We'll now have a break for half an hour and return for the next session.